Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones, here to answer your questions tonight. Attorney General George Brandis, twice elected Tasmanian Senator Jacqui Lambie, who was forced to resign last week after discovering she's a dual citizen. Victorian Green Senator Janet Rice, one of the few Australian women already married to another woman. Shadow Minister for Employment Brendan O'Connor, and Christian broadcaster and former New South Wales Liberal MP Stephen O'Doherty. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. Now, Q&A is live across Australia on ABC TV, iView and News Radio at 9:35 p.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time. And you can stream us around the world on YouTube, Facebook and Periscope. Let's go straight to our first question. It comes from Millie Roper.
I am part of the youngest group of eligible Australians to vote in the same-sex marriage survey, and I'm proud to say those aged 18 to 19 years old were more likely to participate than any other group under the age of 45 years. However, it seems like the conservative views of older Australians are dominating the amendments being made to the Marriage Act, with religious freedoms becoming the centre of such amendments. I would like to know how such religious protections relate to the Marriage Act itself at all.
George Brandis.
Well, congratulations on your first participation in voting, and like you, I'm delighted that there was a yes vote. I think that last week was an extremely happy week for Australia, and what the government is determined to do is to pass the bill through the Parliament so that we have same-sex marriage, we have marriage equality by Christmas. Now, the fact that it's being discussed in Parliament means that we are going to have a discussion, and the whole point of a discussion is that people with different views are entitled to have their views heard. 62% of people may have voted yes, but 38% of people voted no, and they're entitled to have their views heard in the debate as well. What the Prime Minister and I, as two of the government's principal advocates for the yes vote, have always said is that there is no inconsistency whatsoever between recognising the right of same-sex couples to marry, which this Prime Minister has worked for in a way that no other Australian Prime Minister has ever done, and at the same time respecting traditional religious freedoms. There's no inconsistency whatsoever, and I can promise you, Millie, that the debate on the amendments to which you've referred will not derogate from the decision of the people, nor will they delay its enactment by the Parliament.
George, briefly, the Australian's reporting you're planning to appease Conservatives by incorporating elements of an international human rights bill into the Act. Is that true?
Well, it seems to me that because there were claims made in the campaign that a yes vote would affect religious freedoms, claims that I completely reject, by the way, as I indicated in my answer to your first question, I think it will do no harm to have a declaratory statement in the bill based on the language of Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights to the effect that nothing in the bill can limit or take away from a person's right to manifest their religious faith by worship, practice, observance or teaching, which is the language of the Covenant. Now, if we introduce those words, they'll make no difference whatsoever to the right of same-sex people to marry, but they might provide a level of reassurance to those who were not convinced to vote yes.
OK. Janet Rice, are you convinced these amendments, or particularly that amendment, might work?
Last week, Millie, was an amazing display of support for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex and queer Australians. And there was great outpouring of joy, also a lot of relief, having sort of got through 2 months where there was a lot of harm being done. And Australians voted for equality. They did not vote for further discrimination. And so I actually am very concerned about the push by sort of people they're basically trying to use marriage equality as a bit of use religious freedom, so-called religious freedoms, as a Trojan horse to try and entrench actually further discrimination against LGBTIQ people. We voted for equality. The bill that is Dean Smith's bill, which is now the cross-party co-sponsored bill, which has begun debate in the Senate, it has got more than enough religious protections in it.
So you wouldn't agree to George Brandis' notion of putting Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights into the bill?
Look, it's not necessary. I think we do need to have further discussion about making sure that people's ability to not be discriminated against because of their religious identity is protected. But the way the Greens would like to see that is actually to have a comprehensive Charter of Rights and a comprehensive Human Rights Act. And let's discuss the issue of further religious exemptions in that context.
Janet, we're going to come...
Not trying to bolt it on through the marriage act.
We're going to come to that issue in a moment. Brendan O'Connor, just dealing with the issue of the bill.
Well, look, I think, well, firstly, congratulations, Millie, on your participation on the survey, which really did say that overwhelmingly Australians wanted to see marriage equality. And I think I agree with George. I think it's a wonderful week, and you know, we should reflect on that. But of course, we would be concerned if there were efforts to amend the, if you like, Dean Smith bill to, in a way, affect the current discrimination laws, that is, watered down anti-discrimination laws that are in this country. So whilst I've heard what George is saying, and he's saying it in good faith, I certainly would like to see the proposed amendments. Labor would like to see the proposed amendments. So you're not
rejecting that out
Well,
of
I think
hand.
we first need to see them. I mean, Janet's right. It is somewhat strange that those that tend to advocate against a Bill of Rights might be placated by elements of a Bill of Rights as a form of amendment into the bill. Now, I read Senator Dean Smith's speech to the Parliament, and I don't tend to spend most of my time reading Liberal senators' speeches, I have to admit.
It was a good speech.
But it was a very good speech, and what he says in that speech too was that the religious freedoms and protections are contained within the bill. So it would have to be a compelling case for Labor to want to see any changes to what was a bill that was an outcome of cross-party conversation and discussion.
OK, Stephen O'Doherty, you are a Conservative in this regard. Do you want to see major amendments?
Yeah, we need to do far more than just pay lip service to the international covenants in the bill. That's wholly inadequate, grossly inadequate. There's more protection now for people on the basis of sexuality than there is on the basis of their religion. Millie, not long ago during the campaign, there was a young woman who Facebooked, not much older than you, Facebooked that it's OK to vote no, and I presume you agree with her right to do that?
Yes, definitely.
On the strength of that Facebook post, she was sacked from her job. Do you think that's OK?
No.
Well, the amendments that myself and my colleagues want are precisely to protect that young woman and anybody else who wants to simply express a view about marriage and not be punished for it. The same protections that are afforded to people for sexuality ought to be afforded to people who hold religious views.
OK, Stephen, I'm just going to interrupt you, Stephen, just for a moment, because the Attorney-General wants to jump in here.
Well, Stephen,
Millie has her hand up.
We'll go back to Millie.
Stephen, I do think that's a different argument. And, you know, let's be very plain about this. What the Australian people voted for overwhelmingly last week was a very simple proposition. Should the law be changed to allow same-sex couples to marry? That was the question that was put to them, and it was the only question that was put to them.
Yeah, what a shame we didn't have some leadership from the government or the opposition on what it would look like, because you've created consequences.
Stephen,
deal with those
just for both of you for a second. Just hold on for both of you for a second, because we're just going to hear from Millie, who had a hand up. Go ahead, Millie.
I think I just wanted to say that when you say that, you know, we're protecting the LGBTQI plus community more than we're protecting religious people, people of Christian and Catholic views haven't been persecuted and they haven't been systematically oppressed.
I accept what you say.
People of the LGBTQI plus community have for centuries. So I think this debate was about improving their rights. And in doing that, we need to make sure that discrimination can't happen on any level. And when people say that it's okay to discriminate against a gay couple when it's legally and morally wrong to discriminate against a single gay person, it's just unjustified.
Yes, but
Millie, we're going to have you on this panel in a year or so. I can just see it. Thank you. Yeah, OK. I want to hear from Jacqui first. No, we haven't heard from Jacqui. I'd like to hear from her. Go ahead.
You know what bothers me with Parliament? They always put in this great stuff, but what they don't do is fill in the gaps. And there is gaps here. There is still 30% of those Australians that lost out on that vote, and they are feeling the hurt from that. And I don't hear anyone talking about that, which I find quite disturbing. Congratulations, you won. I was part of that 37% that said no because of my religious beliefs. And I've made it very clear to Tasmanians when I was a senator, if the majority voted for that, I would vote with them. That is part of my job, as I was with the senator, and I have no problem with that. But you still have nearly 40% of Australians out there hurting right now. And what they're worried about now is that people that have been ringing me that have garden weddings, they're making cakes. You know, I had a bloke ring me about 2 weeks ago saying, Jacqui, I want to know what my rights are right now because I only want to marry man and wife in my garden. And I said, mate, I'm sorry, I can't help you out with that. He's now going to sit in limbo for months. Why should he do it? He has a freedom in this country. He has a right to say, you know what, because of my religious freedom, my religious beliefs, I cannot marry you in my backyard. And this is what you are doing to people because you are going out there bull at a bloody gate, as politicians do, and yet they haven't filled in the gaps. How long are these people going to have to go through more pain? They've lost. They're feeling the pain. How much longer do they have to feel more pain?
Jacqui, I'm just going to interrupt you there because there's a question along those lines. We'll go straight to it from Jeffrey Jones.
My question is to Brendan O'Connor. Regarding the recent plebiscite result, diverse Western Sydney will want strong conscience provisions when the Marriage Act is changed. Muslim bakers from Bankstown will want the right to opt out of baking cakes for gay weddings. Maronite families from Punchbowl will want the freedom to establish schools that teach the Maronite ethos. And Christian Samoan preachers won't want to be dragged before any hate speech tribunals. Can you see why promises to protect these people's rights at a later, unspecified date might sound insincere?
OK, we'll go to Brendan O'Connor first. I'll hear from Janet as well.
Clearly, there are protections afforded to religious institutions insofar as who they choose to marry. That's contained within the Dean Smith bill. However, it's also critical to ensure that we do not go backwards when it comes to anti-discrimination laws. I mean, it would be absurd, offensive and ironic that we would find ourselves going backwards in discriminating against same-sex couples in order to reintroduce and indeed qualify anti-discrimination laws that exist already in this country. So I don't accept the proposition that religious pastors or religious preachers or others who choose to marry only heterosexual couples are discriminated against insofar as the bill that's being proposed by Senator Smith. And for that reason, I think, and that's the thing I'm worried about, that people will attempt to create a scare campaign to misrepresent the actual bill that's before the Parliament, which we've been debating, I might add, certainly in the case of the House of Representatives, for over 40 hours. It wasn't like we haven't thought these things through. And there's been hundreds and hundreds of hours, of course, that has led to the outcome of that bill. And it's one of the very few decisions, whilst we didn't support the survey and we've said it was an expensive waste of time, I have to say the result of the survey certainly endorsed the view that overwhelmingly Australians want to see the end of discrimination against same-sex couples, and their right to marry should be enshrined in law. Okay, and I don't
Brenda, I'm just going to... Janet's got a stake in this, a personal stake.
Yes, I mean, Jeffrey, you've got some serious concerns, but I think largely they are unfounded because religious organisations and ministers will continue to have the right to choose who they marry. And nobody is going to be forced to marry. If you're a church or another religious institution, you're not going to be forced to marry people that you don't want to marry.
How about a celebrant?
A celebrant is a different matter. A civil celebrant is a public servant, and they have the job of being a public servant, and they should not have the right to discriminate against people who are otherwise allowed to be married.
There it is.
So the issue of allowing people to say, you know, the bakers, the florists, to say, no, I don't want to marry you, that is a huge step away from our current anti-discrimination laws.
With respect,
on the basis of individual belief to say, no, I don't want to do that. That's discrimination against LGBTI people well beyond. We don't discriminate against people with disabilities. We don't discriminate against on issues of race. We don't allow that, and we shouldn't allow it for LGBTI people.
Well, the law currently doesn't allow it, and the law is not...
Okay,
The law can't
Stephen,
be-
I'm just going to say this across the panel. Keep our answers brief because we've got quite a few questions to get to.
Currently, that would be a discrimination under the existing law, and no one's proposing to change that. What people want to change is the right of individual Christians, not just those who are ordained, individual Christians to be able to express a view, and charities run by Christian organisations to be able to act in accordance with their religious views. The law does nothing about that. The right of parents to withdraw their children from same-sex schools classes, safe-sex schools classes, or classes that teach about gender fluidity, if that is not in accordance with their view. The United Nations says that's a fundamental
Stephen,
human
this has
right.
got nothing to do with...
Nations...
just make the point, this has got nothing actually to do with same-sex marriage.
I'm sorry, it does, Tony. That's where we just have to disagree.
Well, then I'll go to George Brandis, the Attorney General, and ask, are all those issues separate to same-sex marriage and the legislation pending? And should it be better done, as I think Peter Dutton, your ministerial colleague, has suggested, to delay and have a separate bill relating to religious rights?
Well, I think they are separate issues. The fact that they are related issues doesn't mean they're the same issue, and we should not lose sight of the fact that last week the Australian people made one decision and one decision only, and that is they decided that we should change the Marriage Act to allow same-sex couples to marry. Now, the Marriage Act already provides certain religious protections, by the way. Section 47 of the Marriage Act already says that a religious celebrant can't be compelled to conduct a particular marriage ceremony. I don't actually agree with Janet. I think that right of conscientious objection should be extended to civil celebrants because, unlike you, Janet, I don't regard them as merely public servants. They are officiants of the ceremony, and if they have a conscientious objection to a particular form of the ceremony, I think it's quite wrong to force them to officiate in a way that would violate their conscience. But if I can go to the gentleman who asked the question, I certainly don't agree with you, sir. I don't agree with you at all that we should use this debate as an opportunity to wind back anti-discrimination law in relation to what is basically a question of commerce, the question of the provision of goods and services. You can't discriminate against gay people in the provision of goods and services at the moment, and if it's unlawful to discriminate against one gay person, how on earth can it be lawful to discriminate against
I'm just going to quickly go back to our questioner, Attorney General. I think you did have your hand up. Do you want to respond to that?
Yes, it's for Janet. So exemption provisions, are they a right of individuals or a privilege of institutions?
Exemptions should be afforded to religious organisations, but if we extend that to individuals, it is going to really unwind so much of our anti-discrimination legislation. We agree that people should have their right to belong to a religious organisation, their religious identity protected. And I think we do need to look at our anti-discrimination laws to make sure that people's religious identity is protected. But being the freedom to not be discriminated against in your religious identity is very different to the freedom to discriminate. And the UN doesn't say that you can be free to discriminate.
I'm not asking for the right to discriminate. I'm asking for an equal right
it says
to
that
be not discriminated
in order to discriminate,
against.
you've got to balance that up because one person's religious freedom is another person's discrimination.
I don't
and
want
that's
to,
what should be
I
balanced
don't
up
want
in our
charities to
Human
lose their
Rights
funding.
Act.
I don't want charities to lose their funding because they express a religious view.
Okay.
All right, Jacqui Lambie, a brief
Australia voted yes.
The problem you have here is, first of all, you've already lost a week at the House of Reps. I believe there's been a week cancelled down there. You are going to put this marriage thing through, like I said, then you're going to leave a massive gap until next year. We've got no idea what's going on with dual citizenship, and I can tell you the Parliament is falling apart. You're going to put one through half, it's falling apart.
No, it's not.
It is falling apart. You have 50%.
Jacqui, we're going to come specifically to that issue, so hold your horses.
So what you're going to do is you're going to get 50% of the answer out there. You're going to say, yes, this is a vote. But what we're going to do is we're not going to worry about the unintended consequences until further on down the track. How is that fair for both sides? OK, I'm going to go to our next question. It's from Adam Stevenson.
Thanks, Tony. Now that the Yes side has got up, debate on marriage equality has turned to whether existing laws are sufficient to protect freedom of speech, conscience and religion. Given Conservatives have traditionally opposed such action, are they just trying to dress up laws that permit LGBTI discrimination? Or have Conservatives turned a new leaf And are we finally seeing the beginnings of a Bill of Rights protecting all Australians as law in this country?
OK, I'll start with Stephen O'Doherty, because perhaps a Bill of Rights is what you need.
Yeah, look, there are two different views on this, and I'm...
Where do you stand?
Well, I can see the value in both. I'm starting to believe, people probably don't understand, Australia has no protecting legislation for religious belief at a federal level. And every state is different. So in some states, you're less free to express your religion than in other states. I don't think that's appropriate now in the 21st century with the type of society we are. I love the fact that Australia voted yes, and I'm fully respecting of that, and I expect to see plenty of people...
Stephen, would a Bill of Rights solve your problems?
Yes, it will, unless it restricts our freedoms. I think it's well worth considering.
You've got to balance these freedoms.
OK, I've got to go back to George here, because you've opened the door a little bit of a crack by introducing part, or attempting to introduce part of a human rights treaty into the Act. What about an entire Bill of Rights?
That's not right. So, let me explain. What I'm proposing is we pick up some of the words, the descriptive words of a particular clause in the ICCPR about religious freedom, not to make it the foundation of a right, but merely as a protection to make it clear that nothing in the bill to legalise same-sex marriage limits or derogates from the right of people to manifest worship or religious practice or teaching. Now, that is not to bring in a religious Bill of Rights by the back door. I'm actually opposed to the idea of a Bill of Rights for a deep philosophical reason. I do not think rights are conferred by the state. I think rights need to be protected by the state, but they are not conferred by the state, which is why, way back in 2008, I argued the case against a Bill of Rights when the Rudd government was thinking about introducing one, and the then Attorney-General, Robert McClelland, was actually persuaded that it was a bad idea, but instead, where we landed was to have a parliamentary human rights committee so that human rights issues could be at the centre of the political debate rather than be, as it were, subcontracted to the courts.
How did that go for you, actually?
It went very well. So, Jacqui, it went very well, so that now every every bill that is considered by the Australian Parliament has to be assessed against various human rights standards.
Gillian Triggs was here right now, because I don't think Gillian would be agreeing with you.
No, she wouldn't, because she believes in a Bill of Rights.
I mean, Australia is the only Western democracy that doesn't have a Bill of Rights or a Charter of Rights, and the Greens have been campaigning for one, and I'm really pleased to hear that there are some on the Conservative side now who are supporting that call.
We're wavering.
And that's where we need to be doing the balancing up.
What can you do for us?
Of one person's freedom being another person's discrimination.
It doesn't sound, Stephen, with respect, you've got a very principled position.
Let's quickly hear from the opposition. If you're in government, Bill of Rights, possible or not?
It's true. In fact, I was the Justice Minister when Rob McClelland did entertain the idea when he was Attorney-General, and we didn't get far on it. I guess this debate that we're having, though, has really brought this back into focus, because it is quite interesting that some of the advocates who wanted to change 18C are now, in this debate, talking about affording more protection for religious freedom and religious institutions. And if that has changed the mindset of those who've been fully resistant to the notion of a Bill of Rights, then I think it's a worthy debate. But I agree with, and this is probably the first time I've said this, I agree with Peter Dutton. It's a debate we should have separate to the bill that's before the Parliament in a couple of weeks, and it should be something we can look at in the new year, because we should be focusing on the question of enacting marriage equality. That's our job as parliamentarians. That will be delayed now as a result of perhaps as a result of the deferral of the Parliament sitting.
No, it won't.
But
it will not.
Well, by a week.
No, it won't, because it wouldn't be.
The point I was going to make is,
make it quick,
but it's an interesting debate, and we should. And I think we can have that debate about a Bill of Rights for or against, but it should not delay or deflect or deny the will of the people in relation to marriage equality.
Well, Brendan, I completely agree with you, but it won't delay it, because next week was always going to be the week in which the bill was considered by the Senate, and the following week was always going to be the week in which it was considered by the House of Representatives. All
right, we've got a more controversial question coming up. It's from Glenn Mohammed.
Question for the panel. It's wonderful to empower the LGBTI minority by accepting same-sex marriage. But moving away from the traditional definition of marriage as one man and one woman raises unique challenges. Perhaps it is time to accept that adult relationships come in different forms, varied by different practices, cultures, and traditions, and allow the same-sex equality to other minorities that practice polygamy, such as Mormon Christians and Muslims.
Jacqui Lambie.
Oh. Haven't we moved it on yet? Okay.
Just give a brief answer.
Yeah, I don't really know what to say to your answer, actually. I think we've just about covered the topic to death, to be honest. And I think I'm not the only one. We'd just like to move it on, and what we'd like to see is it all done and everybody's rights put into place. So if you do not want to marry those people, or you don't want to bake a cake for the other side, then you should have that right to do so. And I'd really like that done as quickly as possible, and I just don't see that happening at the end of the year. I'll be honest with you, they're going to leave it half open and the rest are going to sit there and wonder what the hell they're supposed to do and what the law is. You can't leave it like that. You're going to have to, you just can't leave it sitting there like that, George. It's just not going to work. What are these people supposed to do? You've got an open an
George,
opportunity to open window.
do you know what, Jacqui? I'm just going to bring George to the question
What
that was just
happens
asked
with this
for
gap?
a brief answer. It was what some on the No campaign referred to as the slippery slope argument.
Well, Senator Bernardi, I think, famously made some slippery slope arguments, which were, I thought at the time and still think, were ridiculous. What the Australian public has decided to do, by an overwhelming margin, is to instruct the Parliament to amend the Marriage Act to enable same-sex couples to marry. That's what the debate was about. That's what all that the debate was about. Now, some Christian Conservatives have raised the sort of issues that Stephen has raised and that Jacqui has raised, and as a result, as I said before, I think it will do no harm to put in a protective provision that gives reassurance to those people without for a moment derogating from the purpose of the bill, because they are not inconsistent. You can have religious freedom and you can have same-sex marriage at the same time, and by Christmas we'll have both.
Jacqui, I'm going to rule a line under that discussion now. We're going to move on. Next question is from Cara Dooley-Heath.
Christopher Pyne announced today that the lower house will not resume next week. Is the government using a Senate's delay over same-sex marriage legislation to avoid a revolt from its backbenchers over a Royal Commission into banks?
Brendan O'Connor.
Well, I do think the reason, whatever the ostensible reason was for not turning up to work next week, it was wrong for the Prime Minister to prevent the House of Representatives sitting next week. There are 53 items of business before the House. There are many things we could be debating next week, even if the Senate is entertaining and debating the bill to enact marriage equality. And I'm quite frankly, I was absolutely shocked of the decision today to prevent the Parliament sitting next week. I know it's a tough week for the Prime Minister, and I know it's a tough week because he's got a few numbers down and he's worried about a Royal Commission into the banks getting up or stopping the penalty rates decision in its tracks. But, you know, a lot of workers have difficulty going to work and they have hard weeks. Nurses and plumbers and teachers might not want to turn up one week, but they don't get to. They have to turn up. And the Prime Minister should be turning up next week, as should the government, and we should be debating matters in the Parliament.
Janet.
Cara, it's a great question. I mean, the Prime Minister is running scared. He has lost control of his own party and now he is very fearful that he was going to lose control of the Parliament, which is why they're not going back next week. You know, the Greens have... the bill for a parliamentary commission into the banks has already been through the Senate. The Greens bill for that, it is actually sitting there able to be voted on by the House of Representatives. But because they're 2 votes down, the Prime Minister just decided, no, he's not going to go there. So, I mean, seriously, I mean, there is so much legislation that could be being passed through the House of Reps next week. I mean, is the Prime Minister seriously saying that there's no other business, nothing else that we can do? It's crazy, and it just means, you know, it's making a mockery of our parliamentary system.
Jacqui Lambie.
I just said they're falling apart. I don't know what else you want me to say. It is shocking up there. I've just walked out of there, so it is not pleasant up there. You know, we've got all these people under dual citizenship. They are under dual citizenship. Sad thing is there's a lot of the parliamentarians up there, they know who they are. And let me tell you, it takes 24 hours to get confirmation on whether you're a dual citizen or not from the UK. So if you're having debates about the UK, you politicians know who you are up there, then do the right bloody thing and put it in and resign like the rest of us have done. Because that's the right thing to do and that's leadership. And as for that Banking Royal Commission, God forbid if Christian Wynn actually did what he said and crossed the goddamn floor and brought on that Royal Commission on the banks. And nothing's changed with those banks. They can pretend they're being nice out there. That's rubbish. Nothing has changed with the culture in the banks in this country. Full stop. Bring on that bloody Royal Commission, because there have been a lot of people out there, a lot of Australians, that have gone down because of these banks over the years. And it's time for payback and it's time for some explanations.
George Brandis. Now,
well, let me
go back
to the original question.
Yes.
So first of all, it's wrong to say.
Well, the question was, are you dodging a Royal Commission?
No. Well,
it's tap dancing.
Well, the answer to the question is no. What are the two big issues before Australia at the moment, right now? They're the two issues we've been discussing since this program began, namely getting this legislation through to give effect to the will of the people to enact marriage equality by Christmas, and also to sort out the citizenship issue, an issue which I might say was not of the government's making and has affected people on all sides of politics. So what is the government doing? It's arranging the parliamentary program to prioritise those two issues. In relation to the Senate debate, what's the big debate in Australian politics next week? We know what it's going to be. It's going to be the debate on the Dean Smith bill to give effect to same-sex marriage. It won't be delayed.
George, just to sort of, I suppose to use a colloquial expression, can't the Parliament, that is both houses, walk and chew gum at the same time?
No, they cannot. No, they cannot.
Exactly.
Where have you
We do it
been?
every other week.
Of course they can, but governments have priorities. And as the Prime Minister has said, the two biggest priorities for the government between now and Christmas is to get the same-sex marriage, the marriage equality legislation done. I hope most of the people in the audience think that's a good idea, to give that the first priority. And also, there is a need to sort out the citizenship issue, which affects people, as I say, from all political parties.
George, you have priorities, you mentioned that. Did your priorities change when you realised there are a bunch of National Party MPs who might cross the floor to vote in favour of a Bank Royal Commission or a banking inquiry?
Tony, they did not. And certainly my priorities didn't change.
They did not. They have not yet. They can't because you've stopped Parliament.
Because
That's right.
because I can assure you what my priority as I mean, the bills that have to be amended are bills which are actually within my portfolio, the Marriage Act in particular. The moment there was a yes vote in the marriage postal survey, there's no doubt what my priority was, and that is to get this done by Christmas.
Seems like the government's biggest priority for next week is saving its own skin.
The questioner has her hand up. I'm sorry, George. The questioner has a hand up. Priority.
It just seems to me that the Senate can successfully put the Marriage Equality Act through whilst the lower house continues to deal with other matters. And I think that for Parliament to be, for the lower house to be delayed on the basis of the Senate deciding something just seems to be unnecessary.
I think we might leave that as a comment and go on to our next question because it's related to the other issues. So the next question is from Ranjana Patil.
With the Bennelong by-election a bit of a cliffhanger, there's a real possibility of this government becoming a minority government for the rest of the term. The Labour Party, has vowed to make the life of the Turnbull government difficult at every possible opportunity. Though highly entertaining for some, we, the public, are going to be subject to more chaos and more non-governance. In the interest of the nation and not his own personal ambition, should Malcolm Turnbull dissolve the Parliament and call fresh elections? And this is for the panel.
Jacqui Lambie, I'll start with you.
Oh, geez, I'd be really one-sided. Absolutely call a new election. I'm in. I'm in. I'm renounced. I'm ready to go. Right, bring it on. I don't know what else you want me to say.
OK. Let me ask you this. What's your prediction as to when the next election will be? Because you could end up waiting till the full term before you can run again, or it could be sometime early next year.
I think that the dual citizenship will finish them off. I think there's a lot more people going down than what they're actually saying. I can tell you that there was people coming up to me, and I won't mention any names because I'm not like that, when I went down on the Tuesday saying to me, I think I'm in trouble, and they haven't even been mentioned in the paper. So that is a problem. What I'd like both leaders to do is to say, if you believe you've got dual citizenship before we do the checks, because we're going to take weeks, you can say they're passing all that information into you, but I don't see you working over Christmas. I don't see you getting other embassies and that around the world to do those checks. We're going to now, you're delaying it. You are delaying it, and it needs to be done a lot more professionally than that. We need to know what's going on, and if the Parliament's in turmoil, then it needs to be dissolved and we need to go back to an election. But we have to stop doing this to the Australian people. We are not getting anything done. I congratulate you for getting your marriage equality, and I'm very, very happy for you. But who the bloody hell's running the country and who's running the economy?
Okay,
this is becoming too.
I can hear from the thank you, Jacqui. From the other panellists, Janet Rice.
Look, I think we're really close to another election, Ranjana, because we're in a total debacle. I mean, the whole citizenship situation is only getting worse, and in fact, the process that the government and the Labor Party have combined to put forward, sort of the audit light, it's not really an audit, is only going to actually delay things. The Greens have been calling for an independent, complete audit of all parliamentarians, which would have brought it all to a head very quickly. But I think we are going to see the sort of debacle and the carry-on and the fiasco continue for another couple of months. But I reckon we're looking like going to the polls early next year.
Janet, there is another constitutional minefield, and it relates to beyond the citizenship crisis. It's about holding an office of profit under the Crown.
Yes.
Is that going to come up and bite? That's another part of Section 44. Section 44.4.
Yes. Well, it's certainly being very live at the moment, and it's what our new incoming Senator Andrew Bartlett has been questioned as to whether he, through being an academic at ANU, held an office of profit under the Crown. I mean, that issue under the Constitution, public servants, for example, can't stand for Parliament because they are deemed they have an office of profit under the Crown. But it's been very unclear as to whether people employed by universities or in fact by local government have held an office of profit under the Crown. Our legal advice in the past has been that they haven't, but the High Court's decision on Holly Hughes is actually raising a question mark over that.
Brendan O'Connor.
Well, I think it's a little naive and a little insincere to think that an audit can fix all these matters, and that's why Labor didn't agree to that proposition, because the High Court is the only place that can answer these questions, and the Parliament can refer people that it has questions about. And we conferred that power to the High Court to make those decisions, and for that reason, we've now struck an agreement with the two major parties to ensure that there is universal disclosure. That has now been delayed, so there might be some argument as to when that is, for whether it's December 1.
Universal disclosure of what precisely?
Well,
because currently it's only about citizenship, but what we know about Section 44 is it's got a whole series of clauses. We were just talking about one of those clauses.
And indeed, and certainly Senator Di Natale's idea of having Section 44.1 audited, when in fact, quite frankly, if we were going to do the entire thing, you should be doing the entire section 44, 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5, because in fact there are questions for all provisions of Section 44. I mean, what's the point of saying you are eligible pursuant to Section 44.1, but you may be ineligible for 44.4, for example, and yet it's not being examined.
44.4, let's get this clear. I mean, it seems to prohibit teachers, academics, people who are still holding office in those ways.
Yeah.
Also, people who have pensions that come from the Crown. So military officers potentially.
Well, that's right. So, and again, the only place that question can be answered ultimately will be the High Court. Insofar as determining the facts of a given individual.
I'm going to go to
but I just wanted to make
authority
the point. Just to return to where we are at. We've reached an agreement to have the matter of disclosure determined. We believed in December 1. It's now been pushed back to December 5, I think, and so that we have yet to resolve that. But it needs to be done. And it should include all provisions of 44, but that wasn't agreed.
Let's just hear Stephen O'Doherty. Could this constitutional crisis expand, get bigger, include more politicians, take out more of them, send more of them to the High Court, throw the government into chaos?
Be careful what you wish for. Look, it may well, but the provisions around 44.4, Office of Profit, are pretty well understood. It was only really the citizenship that wasn't understood well. Anyone who was a teacher, state members of Parliament who have pensions, there's been a long line of those that have made arrangements so that that didn't impede them from being a candidate in an election. The reason it's become an issue now is because they had to do a count back. And so someone who took a job after the election as a public servant was ineligible to stand in the vacancy. Like, it gets very complicated, and that's why the High Court has to decide. All of that said, how many by-elections make a general election, I suppose, is a question that the government, that the cabinet needs to solve. Well, and the real problem is, I'd have to say it, and I was always of the view that the High Court, as the Court of Disputed Returns, had to have its say, and that you were always a member of Parliament until it had disqualified you. But if we now know that there are MPs who knew they were not eligible but sat on their hands, that's now a question of trust. And the real issue the nation is dealing with, I'm sorry, is a fundamental lack of trust. And when you lose trust, you've lost the nation.
Janet, very briefly.
Yeah. It's pretty clear that, Section 44 needs to be changed. We need to have a referendum to change it because it's outdated in our modern society. Just looking at the citizenship, where we've got half of all Australians who are either born overseas or a parent who's born overseas, it cuts out so many people from participating in our democracy.
No, it doesn't. You just a moment. First of all, you renounce. You're talking about Greens and standing up for those less fortunate and the Indigenous. Well, you know what's more important than that? I think after seeing this, everybody's going to know about dual citizenship. Okay, I think we all know. It's very self-explanatory. It doesn't need to be changed. But I'll tell you what, Indigenous recognition does. Yeah. You want to put something on the damn table, then put it on. These people can't go by Section 44. Well, tough, like me, you resign. You didn't
do your homework.
You didn't do your homework. No, I didn't do my homework, whatever, okay? And that's right, I didn't do my homework. I wasn't aware of that. Tough. I lose out for that, and so should other people. The other thing that is the problem out there is I've got veterans and aged pensioners saying to me, I've got aged pensioners eating bloody dog food. I've got veterans out there that are fighting DVA saying, hey, all these people that have served Lambie have got, got those big pensions and being flown around and allowed to have those free flights. Are we checking on them? Are we checking on them, George?
Well, there is a procedure, Jacqui, as you know, whereby people have to declare entitlements they claim and register their interests. But can I respond to the question? So, first of all, I actually think the last thing the Australian people want is another general election. It's less than 18 months since the... Jacqui, you might like to have another general election, but politicians might like to have another general election because that's what we do. But seriously, we had a general election less than 18 months ago. In Queensland, where I come from, there's a state election going on at the moment. There'll be state elections in Tasmania and South Australia in March, and I think there's one in Victoria, isn't there, later next year. We have so many elections in this country. Apart from the political class or the media class, they drive people up the wall how many elections there are. So I do not think that the public are demanding an election.
So George, just a quick one though. It's the question raised by Stephen O'Doherty. How many by-elections add up to elections?
Let me just finish the observation I was making, Tony. What the public are demanding, and rightfully demanding, is that the politicians sort the problem out. And as Brendan has said, the coalition, the government and the opposition have had a negotiation, and we've agreed on a process whereby every member of Parliament has to come forward to the registrars of the respective Houses of Parliament that register interests with relevant particulars of their citizenship, so there can be transparency. And if there are problems, I don't know if there are any other problems on my side. I know there are problems with the member for Braddon, Justine Key, and the member for Longman, Susan Lamb, from the Labor Party, who've actually said, well, we hadn't renounced our UK citizenship at the time the 2016 election had been called. But be that as it may, whoever has problems, there can be transparency about that. Now, Tony, you asked me to say how many by-elections make a general election. A general election is a general election. If there are particular cases which the High Court, which, as Brendan rightly says, is the only body that can decide can adjudicate on one of these cases if it's disputed, then so be it. But at the moment, there are two, in New England and in Bennelong.
Just a quick one then. What happens if this expands, gets bigger, becomes a bigger constitutional crisis, if other parts of Section 44 come into play, as we've just been discussing?
Well, I don't accept your characterisation of this as a constitutional crisis. What has happened is that the High Court has made a decision, and as a result of the decision the High Court made, that it read Section 44(1) of the Constitution in a particular, in my view, narrow and literalist way, but that's fine. We obviously respect the High Court's decision. Then it had consequences so far for two members of the House of Representatives.
Yes, but can I just bring you, George, can I just bring you to the point that I just raised, we've been discussing over this side of the panel, which is whether other sections of 44, other parts of Section 44 come into play and potentially disqualify other MPs.
They come into play if there is evidence that somebody may be disqualified. Now, if people want to make an allegation that somebody is disqualified, let them make the allegation. An allegation has been made against Dr Gillespie, for example, under a different section, a part of Section 44, because it is said that he had a commercial interest in a contract. He is disputing that because of the indirectness of the nature of the interest, and that's before the High Court at the moment. But the point I'd make to you, and I'd really urge on you and the audience tonight, is let's not be silly about this and engage in conjecture piled upon conjecture piled upon conjecture. If there is clear evidence of a problem, there is an orthodox process for dealing with it.
Okay.
And an orthodox process for dealing with a problem that is being followed does not a crisis make.
And briefly, you won't expand the disclosure to include other sections of 44.
Well, you don't have a choice, because if someone wants to pay that money and take it to the High Court, then I reckon you're going to be in some trouble, George. You don't get to make that choice.
Well, no, of course I don't. The Houses of Parliament can refer a matter to the court if there is evidence before them.
Okay.
And that is the orthodox process I'm describing.
All right. We're going to move on. This is Q&A. It's live. It's interactive. You can send us your video question or Skype in to ask us a question. Go to the website or contact us by email and Twitter to find out more about how to do that. Now, our next question comes from the studio. It's from Angus Patterson.
Thanks, Tony. Jacqui Lambie, whilst I find many of your opinions to be totally at odds with my political beliefs, I find it quite hard to look away, as we've seen tonight. You appear to be a fierce, committed, passionate advocate for Tasmania and unwilling to be swayed by political forces who encourage you to change political tack. For these reasons, I've even found myself wondering, would I vote for Jacqui Lambie? So my question is, how has Australian politics gotten to the stage that I need to consider voting for a politician with views totally opposed to my own in the hope of genuine, authentic advocacy?
Oh, that's sweet.
You should be careful about that question, because that's how Donald Trump got in.
I know, I wish all men would speak to me like that. There is light at the end of the tunnel, sweetie, loving it. Do you know what? I think this is whether people agree with my views or not. I think that what they can say is, I say it how it is. There is a few elements missing out of politics, and I learnt it in the military. It's called trust, loyalty and honour, and there is none, and there is a massive gap for that to be filled. I'm not going to sit here and lie to anyone. I'm going to tell you the truth whether you like it or not. And if that brings harm to me, so be it. But you start telling lies, you start chasing your tail, and that really leaves you in an awkward situation. I'm not going to put myself in that sort of a situation. You know, politics is really difficult at times, especially as an independent. You are out there by yourself, and it gets bloody tough. I don't have time to chase my tail. And you know what? I hope that, you know, some of my views have softened over the years as I've learnt a lot more, instead of coming out as at a bull at a gate or a wrecking ball when I first come out. And I've grown into that, and I've been very lucky to have that opportunity.
Okay, I was going to test. Let's go back to our questioner. She got your vote? I know you're not a Tasmanian.
Yeah, you'd have to change a couple of things, same-sex marriage, all that Sharia law goings on, but yeah, you're getting close.
Okay, sweetie. We'll go and have some coffee.
Okay,
right.
Let's move on, because it's not a paid political broadcast. The next question is from Tom Dooley-Heath.
Senator George Brandis, you were praised for your response to Pauline Hanson's burqa stunt. You described it as appalling and said it was detrimental to the safety and security of Australian citizens. The Liberal National Party is now preferencing One Nation ahead of Labor in the Queensland state election. By potentially giving One Nation a greater platform, is the LNP sacrificing the safety of Australians for their own political gain?
George.
Well, I'm sorry, but it's not. It is not. So the assertion you make is simply wrong. As the leader of the LNP, Tim Nicholls, has said time and again, there have been no deals, there have been no arrangements, there will be no coalition, there will be no joint ministries, nothing. So the assertion is simply false. And by the way,
does that mean no preferences?
If there were,
there will be lots of preferences.
The LNP is deciding on a seat-by-seat basis. In some seats, the preference distribution is one way. In other seats, it's another way. But by the way, if there were a deal, which there isn't, why is the One Nation Party preferencing the Labor Party in 22 of the seats in which it's running?
Okay, Brendan O'Connor.
Overwhelmingly, the One Nation vote and the Liberal vote are cross-preferencing.
That's not correct. Brendan, that is just not true.
That is the truth of it,
That is just not true. In about 40% of seats,
and the reality
One Nation is preferencing Labor.
In the seats that can change hands. And the reality is that you saw Malcolm Turnbull on the weekend turn up at a launch to support the LNP to form a government with the support of One Nation, and of course then wants to go down to Bennelong and tell that community that it's sort of okay for him to be in Queensland supporting One Nation, or certainly allowing for preferencing swaps. Well, I'll tell you what, I didn't think I'd be here defending John Howard, but John Howard wouldn't have stood for this. John Howard did not support One Nation in this way. John Howard would say, put them last. That's what Malcolm Turnbull should say, put them last, because they don't deserve a vote, and they don't deserve certainly a cross-preference deal with a major party. But unfortunately, that's not happening in Queensland.
George, just briefly, has the LNP leader, Tim Nicholls, categorically ruled out a deal of any kind?
Yes, he has. And might I say, Brendan, since you made the observation you made, which is simply not true, remember that Pauline Hanson stood up in the Senate earlier this year and revealed that in January of this year, the State Secretary of the ALP, Mr Moorhead, approached her staff to ask for a deal from the Labor Party.
Sure she did. Yeah, I believe
Janet, I'm going to bring Janet in.
Liberal preferences, George, are going to mean that One Nation members get elected into the Queensland Parliament with their racism, their prejudice, all of their outrageous, appalling views. That's what your support for One Nation means. And I think that's...
Don't say that, Janet. Nobody has taken a stronger stance against Pauline Hanson and One Nation
unless you put One Nation last, Liberal preferences are going to elect One Nation members of Parliament in Queensland. It is absolutely true. That is what's going to happen. You are giving One Nation a leg up in Queensland.
Janet, can I please tell you about the way the Queensland election is going, because I actually am following it very closely, being the only person here from Queensland. The reality is that in a lot of the seats in which One Nation is most competitive, if it gets over the line, it is more likely to be from the Labor Party or from other minor parties like the Katter Party than from the LNP. There is no such deal, there is no support, and you should stop saying there is, because it's just not the truth.
Jacqui, Lambie, no, I know you're not a Queenslander, not even a senator anymore, but...
Thank you for reminding me about that, Tony.
That's brutal.
The one that tell me your job's about to come vacant, so be very careful.
Anything can happen. Anything can happen.
You're taking no prisoners tonight, Jacqui.
Let me just ask you this. What do you actually think of Pauline Hanson and One Nation?
Look, I actually haven't had a lot to do with... What I do is when they first get up there, I'm very, very careful because I understand what it's like to be up there that first 12 months. So I've just stayed away. I've got enough problems or issues of my own to deal with, being an independent.
I've never heard you short of an opinion on anything. But on One Nation, you have no opinion?
No. I mean, they're doing their job. They vote with the Liberals a lot. We already see that. Everyone has their own preference for whatever. But I'll tell you what, it really takes that first 12 months or 18 months to actually learn how everything's done. So it's actually quite difficult. Then you've got to get your staff and legislation. So
all right.
I don't want to put a judgment on them until later.
All right. Stephen O'Doherty.
If you build a manifesto, a political manifesto based on dividing people, putting people down because of their race, because of their creed, because of what they wear, because of their religious expression, because of who they are, if you build your manifesto on hate, you've got no claim to govern this country. And I was proud when I was a Member of Parliament in New South Wales that we always put One Nation last during my period. And it would be a...
Jeff Kennett did it here.
Yeah, it would be a sad day if that changed. Our political parties are being asked for leadership. And leadership means you put out what you believe in. If you believe in bringing people together, you cannot be in bed with a party that drives people apart, particularly on the basis of their religion or race. Or sexuality, for that matter.
Yes, or sexuality.
I've got time for one last question. It's from Ola Al-Sabri.
Why is Turnbull so stubbornly refusing to accept New Zealand's offer to resettle the men on Manus Island?
Stephen, I ended with you. I'll start with you on this one.
I don't... we'll get round to George. I'll be interested. George, please, we are better than this as a country. And it's not your decision, it's a cabinet decision. It's a cabinet decision, but for the sake of showing that we're so tough that we will never let anybody in from that particular group. You know, I spoke with a nun who was up there recently. People are committing suicide. They can't get adequate medical protection because Papua New Guinea just isn't set up. Manus Island is not set up to provide for it, particularly the types of conditions they have that relate to their mental illness. 4 years without any prospect of ever being resettled anywhere. You're taking away people's humanity. We cannot do that and hold up our heads as a nation that used to be proud to call itself a fair-go nation.
Brendan O'Connor.
Well, I think it's certainly an offer that should be properly considered and I hope accepted.
Would you have accepted it?
Look, I think at the time when we were going through, I think, very difficult times where we had, as people know, we had unseaworthy arrivals. We had people not leaving places of persecution, but leaving even transit countries.
So briefly, you wouldn't have accepted
well, I'm saying
it at that
well,
time?
you know that there was an offer, and we didn't actually accept it at the time. But at the time, there wasn't people indefinitely in detention for almost 5 years. We have now people...
Did you not anticipate that could happen?
Well, can I say... Well, there's a lot of sanctimony and righteousness that some people bring to this debate. I don't, because I've been a minister in this area. And let me tell you this. It is one of the most diabolical and difficult issues to deal with, and anyone who thinks it's easy and thinks there's a simple solution are lying or kidding themselves. This is a complex international challenge. There are tens of millions of people displaced around the world, and we need to provide support for them where we can. But let me tell you this, do not think this is an easy area to be fixed. My point is now, I think insofar as what's happening today, we've had people in those offshore centres waiting indefinitely for years. I don't bring righteousness and sanctimony because I've been an Immigration and Home Affairs Minister, knowing how complex, how difficult, how diabolical this area of public policy is for any nation. That's particularly those who are reaching out to settle people. But I say this, I mean, we should do a lot more. We should be engaging as a global citizen to make sure that the Refugee Convention architecture's changed. We should be trying to get Malaysia and Indonesia as signatories to the Convention. I mean, there's so many things we should be doing.
But very briefly...
But insofar as this, I think we should accept the offer made by New Zealand, and I understand the reasoning perhaps by the government, but I think they should reconsider.
We've got to move around because we're running out of time. Janet.
What's happening on Manus Island is a horrifying humanitarian emergency, and those men need to be moved from there immediately because there are people that are dying. We have been torturing these men. We have been leaving them there without adequate medical support. They are innocent people who sought our asylum, and we have abandoned them. Absolutely. Papua New Guinea and New Zealand, because Australia having shirked our responsibility, New Zealand is stepping up, and those men should be off to New Zealand as quickly as possible, because their lives are at stake. Innocent people's lives are at stake, and it's on our conscience what is happening there.
Jacqui Lambie.
Well, innocent people have already died because you guys, and not worry about national security, let those boats come in for so long. This is your problem. You started it. Let's be honest about that. Let's be honest. OK, you are now cleaning this mess up. And I think you've done a wonderful job of stopping that boat. At least I'm not having the Navy go out there and pick up any more dead kids.
There are people dying
dead bodies.
Jacqui. There are people dying.
I've seen the
Manus
dead
Island.
bodies.
Do you know what?
I've seen.
Yeah, OK, you might have done. What about our national security and what about the rest?
About to break out on Manus
Let me
Island.
tell you something. When I was the minister, when a boat foundered against the rocks on Christmas Island and people perished, and I was involved in setting up a temporary morgue and saw men, women and children, bodies in that, because they'd come down. Didn't leave persecution when they got on that vessel. Hold on a second.
OK,
because
no,
people like
you
to
didn't stop it. You let it go. Both of you let it go.
Just hold on. Because we can all use emotion. I saw the bodies of men, women and children. And let me tell you, when they got on that vessel, at that point, they were not fleeing persecution. Now, we have to find a way to stop people embarking on unseaworthy vessels where they kill themselves. Now, that's why I don't bring righteousness or sanctity to this debate. It's very complicated. Of course we could do more. And that's why Labor has said we want to double the 13,750 to 27,000 for settlement places. And we need to do more, sure. But this is a very difficult area. It's easy to throw your hands up and say you should have fixed it.
Sorry, I'm going to go to the Attorney-General for the last word. And the question was, why is Turnbull so stubbornly refusing to accept New Zealand's offer to resettle men on Manus Island?
Well, first of all, I think we should listen with a great deal of respect to what Brendan O'Connor, who obviously isn't on my side of politics but had responsibility at one time, has said. This is an extremely difficult problem. It is an extremely difficult problem, and it's not going to be solved by pieties or nice words. That's the first point. Secondly, I think history is instructive here. The Manus Island Offshore Processing Centre was opened as a result of an agreement reached between Kevin Rudd, when he was the Prime Minister, and Peter O'Neill, the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea. And ever since the coalition has been in government, we have been trying to fix this problem. And we started by stopping the boats. Yeah. And by stopping the boats, we stopped the drownings. People who sort of play the humanitarian card somehow always seem to forget about the more than 1,200 men, women and children who drowned at sea because the borders were out of control. We stopped that.
George, hold on. We're just about out of time. A questioner has a hand up. Going to go to her and then come back to you.
Australia is literally constructed based upon after the Aboriginals' waves of immigration. So when you, it's really funny to hear you have the audacity to come here and say that you're stopping the boat. That is equivalent to saying that you are killing all these people. That is not okay. That is disgusting. And you can hide behind the screens and everything, but we see it as murder. That is murder. You're killing all those people.
Well, with all due respect, that's a ridiculous thing to say. Every country in the world is entitled to decide who comes to the country and how they come here. Now, Australia per capita runs the most generous refugee and humanitarian migration program in the world. And the reason the Australian people are willing to be so generous is they know that it is the government that decides who comes here and how they come.
George, I'm sorry. OK, we have to finish the program, so I'm just going to ask you just one quick question. Are you about to reconsider the New Zealand offer?
Well, the Prime Minister said on the 5th of November, let us deal with the American offer, an offer to take up to 1,250 people. It is in progress at the moment, Janet.
It is in progress
at the moment.
And there are men that are dying on Manus Island, men who sought out...
It is being executed at the moment because the Americans are entitled to process those people.
I'm sorry to interrupt the process here, but we're just about out of time. So just a quick answer, are you reconsidering the New Zealand
We're
offer?
not reconsidering. What the Prime Minister says is once we settle the American deal and have that executed, we will look at other options.
Including the New Zealand option?
That's what he said at the time.
So that's still on the table?
That's already been said by Malcolm Turnbull.
All right. That's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, George Brandis, Jacqui Lambie, Janet Rice, Brendan O'Connor and Stephen O'Doherty. Thank you to this wonderful Melbourne audience. And remember, you can continue the discussion on Q&A Extra with Tracy Holmes and LGBTIQ mediator and author Cam McFedrin. They're taking comments and questions on ABC News Radio and Facebook Live just as soon as we finish here. Now, next Monday on Q&A, who knows? Will Parliament be sitting? Well, it's hard to say. Queensland Liberal James McGrath, the Senate will be sitting, we know that, agreed to join the panel alongside Queensland Labor MP Murray Watt in the aftermath of the Queensland election. Plus, the Guardian's politically savvy Australian editor Lenore Taylor. She'll definitely be here. As for the rest, we'll keep you posted. Until next week's topsy-turvy Q&A, good night.